1493, Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus returned to Spain with news of undiscovered islands, later recognized to be the New World. 5 years later, Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope and found a southern route to India. The age of exploration had begun. The two rival kingdoms met together and drew two lines on the globe dividing the world into two spheres, with monopolies granted to a Portuguese half and a Spanish half. While the Spanish set about conquering the New World and the Portuguese established a trade empire in the Indian and South Atlantic Oceans, neither side were aware of the small piece of the American continent which lay in Portugal's half of the globe. Before European discovery, South America was inhabited by numerous Native Americans who had migrated from the north either by land or by shallow coastal sailing. We aren't entirely sure. These early migrants lived in harsh conditions in the most diverse bioecosystem in the world. These native groups subsisted mostly on agriculture, but there were some hunter-gatherer communities as well. And before you ask in the comments, yes, there were some cannibals. Most of these tribes lived on the coast and were broadly categorized into Tupi and Tapawea, although the diversity did not make too much of an impression on the Europeans. Here to help me out with early Brazil is Joe from the channel Jabsy.
Upon Vasco da Gama's successful return from rounding the African continent in 1499, the Portuguese decided to begin trade in the Indian Ocean. Pedro Alvares Cabral left the following year for India. Getting blown wildly off course during his southward voyage, he sighted land on the 22nd of April 1500, and a few days later landed at Porto Seguro. They named the locals they met as Indians, just like the inhabitants of the West Indies. But although nearly 95 times its size, Brazil's population was just short of Portugal's at just under 3 million. This land was east of the Tordesillas line, and so was declared for Portugal. The locals traded with the Portuguese for pau-brasil, a wood with a red dye used in Europe, but the trade post was seen as largely inferior to the colonies in Africa and India. However, when the French began importing Brazil wood themselves, Portugal made a more concerted effort to settle in the area.
Early Brazil was divided into 15 colonies and granted to wealthy Portuguese elites. The only successful one, however, was São Vicente Island, which made a moderate profit buying native slaves. So the failing colonies were returned to the Portuguese crown in 1549 and a governor was appointed. Merchants and missionaries were the first to settle. They built a capital city, Salvador, and began trading in the Todos os Santos Bay, mostly in the new cash crop, sugar. To help promote the economy, a group called Bandeirantes was sent to explore the land for minerals and slaves, which increased settlement for the export economy. Slaves became more valuable as natives died from European diseases in large numbers. Missionaries were also very active at this time, mostly Catholic Jesuits who founded the city of Sao Paulo as a missionary school just a few kilometers inland from São Vicente. Another bay, Port January, was established as a French colony called Vilcanhão Island, before the Portuguese kicked them out and renamed it São Sebastião do Rio de Janeiro. When Portugal got busy during a succession crisis in Europe, the newly independent Dutch Republic very briefly swooped in and took over large parts of the colony. It didn't last long, but it did inspire them to put more resources into settling Dutch Guiana. The Atlantic slave trade was kicked off by the Portuguese, buying them on the coast of Africa and importing them to Brazil where they were sold to plantation owners. More than 40% of all African slaves were imported to Brazil. For comparison, just under 5% were imported to the United States. Brazil grew rapidly during the 1600s, creating new export markets for native plants as well as new plantation commodities like tobacco. The system was held together by the Royal Fifth, when 20% of all minerals, crops and other products went directly to the Portuguese crown, accelerating the establishing of public offices like tax collectors, accountants and governors. When gold was discovered in the 1700s, the slavery economy boomed, and exploration of the interior was accelerated to look for new minerals. They opened up new markets to trade with the Spanish Empire and the Rio de la Plata, but when this area became overrun with pirates and smugglers, the Spanish and the Portuguese met to establish a shared border control in 1750. Brazilian culture was becoming increasingly more diverse. Europeans, Indians, and slaves met to form mixed-race groups called pardos, such as the mulattos, cafutzos, and mestizos, with countless numbers of Creoles and ethnic identities. Brazil was to become much more important to the Portuguese crown in the 1800s, thanks in large part to Napoleon. When the Iberian Peninsula was invaded and occupied, the royal family legged it to Rio, where they set up the government during the war. After returning to Lisbon, the king's son, Prince Regent João, declared Brazil independent and crowned himself emperor. A brief independence war ensued where the Portuguese found themselves battling not only the Brazilian army, but also thousands of civilian militia. The Empire of Brazil, however, failed to enact the changes that the wealthy landowners and the liberal elites had overthrown the Portuguese for in the first place, and so the nation was plagued by socialist insurgencies, slave rebellions, and even a republican movement in the Rio Grande do Sul, supported by the Italian nationalist Giuseppe Garibaldi. They spent thousands on wars with the newly independent South American nations as well. Investment in Brazil showed no signs of slowing down. Coffee, which grew extremely well in the Brazilian climate, became the new cash crop, as well as markets in timber and rubber. Eventually, the rate of immigration to Brazil was so high that it obviated the need for slaves, and the practice was ended in 1888. The empire came to an end inspired by the ideals of republicanism and the Enlightenment, and soon a military coup placed Deodoro de Fonseca as the country's first president, the United States of Brazil.